Hello, I'm Dan Jurgen, Vice Chairman of IHS Markit, and I want to welcome you to a CERAWeek conversation presented by IHS Markit. Today, we're very pleased to be talking with Andy Jassy, who is the CEO of Amazon Web Services, otherwise known as the Amazon Cloud, which he started in 2003. And we're going to be talking about how the cloud has changed how business operates, how the world operates, its role in the COVID-19 crisis, and the impact that the cloud is likely to have in the future. Andy, welcome. Very glad to have you back and to continue a CERAWeek conversation here. We couldn't do it in Houston this year, so very glad to be able to do it virtually.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I appreciate you having me. And I missed being able to do it in person, but it's great to be able to do it virtually.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, let me just start with an obvious question. What was the cloud called before it was the cloud?
Well, when we launched AWS, we called it Amazon Web Services, and that's what we were calling the space initially, which was really to allow people to use application programming interfaces or APIs to be able to have technology infrastructure that they can comprise their applications with. If you think about, any technology application you use, it always needs compute or a server. It almost always needs storage. Almost always needs a database. And in the old world, the way this worked was you would have to buy hardware, you'd have to get a data center to put that hardware in and to run it, and then you'd have to buy or build all the software yourself. And all of that was very capital intensive and very time consuming for development teams. And what AWS in the cloud allows you to do is you get to consume the infrastructure software, the hardware, and the data center services as a service itself through an API. And because you're running it in these cloud providers' data centers and you're connecting with it through an API, it feels like that data and all that infrastructure is in the cloud. And that's, eventually we call it AWS, but our second service, which is, really broadly used, our Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2. When we called it Elastic Compute Cloud, people seemed to like that term cloud, and it stuck, and the space became cloud.
So that's where the term cloud came from.
I think so. I think people, it feels like the data and all the infrastructure operations are in the cloud because they're happening through an API call and not in your own data center and somebody else's. But I think that notion, coupled with the fact that we had a service called Elastic Compute Cloud that was one of the very early movers and services that people started to use the cloud for were what drove it.
So Amazon is, of course, known for innovation and rapid innovation, and as I understand, this grew out of your own experience and what you were doing, and realizing that there was a wider commercial use.
Yeah, well, I think that if Amazon, by most people's standards in the 90s and early 2000s, was a company that innovated at a very rapid clip. And yet at the time, I'll call it around the time 2001, 2002, we were very frustrated with the speed with which we were innovating. It felt like it was taking so long. And when you would talk to product development teams and ask them why it took so long, and at the time we were thinking about this, I was in this unusual job working for Jeff Bezos as what we call his shadow, which was really like a chief of staff role. And when we would go talk with people, they would say, look, I think it's great that you guys think this product, and this service should take 2 to 3 months end to end to build, but we're spending 2 to 3 months just on the storage piece, or just on the compute piece, or just on the database piece. And nothing we're building scales beyond our own project, and all of my peers are doing the same thing. And so this, in retrospect, this was probably fairly obvious, but at the time, it was a real aha to us that people internally had this high thirst for reliable, scalable, cost-effective infrastructure services. And we also asked people, we said, well, how much of your time when you're building these features or capabilities is spent on what really differentiates the capability versus that undifferentiated heavy lifting of the infrastructure? And we were stunned to hear that people spent about 80% of their time on that undifferentiated heavy lifting. And so, that was a real realization to us that if you built reliable, scalable, cost-effective infrastructure services, it would allow Amazon to innovate at a much faster clip than we were before. And we thought about Amazon, which is a very strong technology company, and if we had that issue, we figured a lot of other companies probably had that same issue, and so we realized that there might be something to externalize that, and that's really how we started off on the journey of AWS.
Right. And of course, today it's as a business within Amazon, I think the latest public numbers, it's running at about $40 billion a year. So, when you started, you didn't quite maybe see the scale. Kind of, how's it evolved over time, the scale and the nature of the cloud?
Yeah, I think that any of us who've been involved in AWS since the start would have gladly taken where we are in a nanosecond. When we were thinking about it way back in 2003, it was, we've learned this over the years at Amazon. It's very difficult to predict how big a new business idea is going to become, especially when you're really changing the way that consumers or customers are going to interact with the type of technology like we were with the cloud. But it's today, 14 years into having the services in market, it's about a $41 billion revenue run rate business. It's growing a little bit more than 30% year over year. And it has millions of active customers. We consider an active customer a non-Amazon entity that's used our platform in the last 30 days. And it really spans the gamut in terms of customers. In the first half dozen years or so of AWS, you mostly saw startups using the platform. And most of the successful technology startups of the last 14 years have built themselves completely from scratch on top of AWS. And these are companies like Pinterest and Airbnb and Slack and Peloton and Stripe and Robinhood. But what's happened over the last 7 or 8 years, but particularly over the last 5, is that the enterprise and the public sector have really started to adopt AWS in the cloud in a very pervasive way. And you see it in every imaginable vertical business segment. In the energy sector, you see Shell and BP and Hess and Halliburton. IHS Markit just announced an agreement with AWS where they're closing down a number of the data centers to move their workloads to AWS.
Yeah, I think you've pretty much described an incredible scale. Maybe just to build on that, how's it changing the economy and the nature of work?
Well, it really it changes what's possible with companies. And I think there are a few reasons why people have moved to the cloud so quickly, even though we keep reminding ourselves that the business is a reasonable sized business at this point with a $41 billion revenue run rate. But I think we're just at the early stages of the meat of enterprise and public sector adoption. But the reason that people are moving so fast is almost always cost is the conversation starter. If you can turn capital expense into a variable expense, usually that's attractive to people. And the cloud, you don't have to lay out all that capital for the data centers and the hardware. You get to just use the infrastructure as you need it. And then that variable expense is a lower expense than what most companies can do on their own, because we have such giant scale that we pass on to customers in the form of lower prices, where we've lowered our prices on almost 80 different occasions in the last 10 years. That changes what you can do on the variable expense. And then you get real elasticity, where anyone who needs to provision infrastructure knows that you have to guess ahead of time how much you need. And if you guess too little, you end up having an outage if it turns out that you need more. So nobody guesses too little. Everybody provisions for the peak. And there's a reason they call it the peak. You rarely sit at the peak. And so in the cloud, you don't have to guess. You provision what you need. If it turns out you need more, you seamlessly scale up. And if it turns out you hit a peak, you just give it back to us and stop paying for it. So cost is always the conversation starter. But the number one reason that people have adopted the cloud and the way it's most changed a lot of businesses is just the agility and speed with which you can innovate and change your own customer experience. You can spin up thousands of servers in minutes, and then because we have about 200 services that you can use in any combination you want, you can get from an idea to implementation in several orders of magnitude faster. So it's just a very different world with respect to how fast you can innovate.
So before we started, you mentioned that, of course, you had been working at home like so many others and many people who'll be watching this. How has the cloud figured in work during this era of the COVID-19 pandemic, making it possible for people to work at home?
Yeah, I think that we're going through something that's totally unprecedented, and hopefully we'll never go through again as a society. And I think one of the most important things in this crisis has been trying to help people function from where they've had to operate at home. And you see it on both the consumer and the business side. And the consumer side, of course, in our retail business, we, with so many physical stores being closed, we really needed to do everything we could to enable people to have the right access to PPE and to food and to items. And we've had it's been a very challenging opportunity over the last number of months in trying to make sure that people had what they needed. But I think the team has done a really great job, and I think the same thing has been true on the business side with AWS and trying to enable companies to be able to operate from home. And you kind of have seen, all kinds of different scenarios. I mean, there are certain industries during the COVID crisis who have really just substantially surged relative to where they were before. So if you think about gaming, if you have a kid, I have a 16-year-old son who's playing Fortnite every night till 1 a.m. Epic.
Really? No parental intervention there?
Well, attempted parental intervention, but not necessarily successful. The parental intervention needs to end at a certain point to go to sleep themselves. But if you have kids who play video games, things like Fortnite and Epic and Sony PlayStation run in AWS, or if you look at entertainment, Netflix and Disney Plus and Hulu and Prime Video all run in AWS, or if you have to do e-learning, Blackboard and Canvas and video conferencing, Zoom, predominantly runs in AWS. So there are certain industries where we've seen these crazy surges because people have had to operate from home. But it's also true that just functioning as a normal company, those that actually were built on top of the cloud and were able to leverage it, I think have been at a significant advantage relative to those that aren't. Because, again, you could just seamlessly scale up, as we talked about earlier, as you need it and as you have a surge of people at home. But you also can use services, whether it's video conferencing, with Zoom, or with, we have a service called Chime as well, or whether you're going to use, you want to use virtual desktops in the cloud through a service we have called Workspaces. Or we had a number of large companies who overnight had to have their customer service agents work from home, where they spun up our call center service, Connect, and we're able to get thousands of agents up from, really from a standing start. And so I think the cloud has helped people be able to function much more effectively, having to work from home and having to do it very quickly.
Well, I want to ask you about some examples, and we'll get in a couple of minutes to the energy business and the role of AWS in that. But I want to ask you about one specific company that's been talked about publicly. Right now, there's probably no higher priority than a vaccine. And Moderna, which is one of the companies that's on the Warp Speed grant from the US government to develop a vaccine, their CEO has talked in public about what Amazon Web Services has enabled it to do. And maybe you might say a little bit of that in terms of what it means in terms of time saved.
Well, it's a pretty interesting and canonical example of how the cloud can completely change your possibilities and what you can do for customers. And so Moderna built really a digital manufacturing platform on top of AWS, and they were able to use things like EC2, which is our compute service, and S3, and which is our storage service, and Redshift, which is our data warehouse service. And then they use our machine learning to build a number of very deep neural networks that allowed them to kind of be able to predict structures of different strains of what they were trying to solve. And they were working, of course, on mRNA, and they were trying to build a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2. And they were able, by using machine learning, predict these structures and predict what they would have in various simulations. They were able to build a vaccine in 63 days in what normally takes 20 months. And so under any circumstances, that would be remarkable. But if you especially think about the environment in which we live today, that it's very important.
And so it was the capabilities of the cloud, of your cloud, that enabled them to almost abolish time, traditional time.
Yeah, they didn't have to. They didn't have to buy the hardware. They didn't need the data center. They didn't have to build the infrastructure software. They just used our compute and our storage and our data warehouse. and then our machine learning capabilities to scale up and scale down as they needed to really, in really rapid fire, be able to build something much faster than they otherwise would. I mean, 63 days versus 20 months is a total game changer.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, and it's an incredible example of what's possible, and of course, so important to every single person watching this, whether their vaccine works or somebody else's works.
Yeah.
To the energy industry and how you see the cloud enabling companies to innovate and change their business practices within the energy business.
If you think about one of the biggest benefits of the cloud, it's the ability to move quickly and to innovate on behalf of your customers quickly. But when you have data, as most enterprises do, that live all over the place in all these different silos, it's incredibly difficult to actually do much with that data or to do analytics on that data. And so, I think that a good example of and typically what you want to do is you want to take that data and consolidate it in one place, what people often call a data lake. And the vast majority of companies build these data lakes on our object storage service called S3, where we have tens of thousands of these data lakes on there, so they can then run the analytical tools off of this one place where the data is and set the right permissions, et cetera. And so, we started working with Shell on their subsurface data universe, which they call their OSDU. And what they were really trying to build was just a big repository that had their seismic to completion workflows there. And what they really wanted to do was they wanted to have this one place where they could run lots of analytics and kind of almost endless simulations. And data scientists had all types of ways they wanted to use this data. And so we built this with them. And then they appropriately thought about it and said, well, we want to actually democratize this data set so that lots of other companies can do the same type of exploration. And as importantly, we'll get a number of ISVs and systems integrators who will build to enable us to do more in the analytics and then what we can do with this data. And so they really opened this up and made it, they actually donated their code, and they built this OSDU. And so that now you have at least 8 energy companies using it, about 45 ISVs, about 35 SIs. It's just totally changed access to that data and what you can find from it and what you can do and how you can save money and time and energy in the explorations process. Or you can look at Woodside, which has gas plants really all over the world, and they were trying to innovate on the traditional way that you ran these and you did maintenance and you operated them. And so they went about building, really using machine learning and AI to build an intelligent asset that tried to fuse together all of this historical data and how the plants were used and how they were operated, about 200 different data sources, and then along with fusing that data with thousands of real-time sensors or IoT sensors on their various assets. And then what they did was they used multi-LiDAR from cameras that they had in their facilities to really build a physical picture or video of how their plants were operating at any one time. And then when they saw there was a problem, they used robots to do the troubleshooting. And so if you think about it, what they're able to do now is they have all this historical data. They've built models to analyze and predict what's going to happen based on the historical data. They have real-time inputs. They have a visual representation of what's happening in their plants. And then they're able to run all these simulations on different scenarios, such that now what they're able to do is they're able to predict when there might be a failure or a maintenance issue up to a week before it actually happens. And everybody that does anything in the industrial space knows it's much less expensive if you catch the issue before it actually breaks. And so those are, to me, 2 good examples of totally changing what's possible, inside your company with data or in your plant operations.
So it really kind of 3 main outcomes. One is in terms of speed, one is in terms of cost, and one is in terms of operations that
and safety too.
And safety, that's right, which for the energy industry is a absolute top priority.
Good deal.
Do you ever find, you describe some of the companies that are sending things, streaming things at Airbnb, et cetera. But now you're working with really big established companies that obviously worry a lot about safety. Do you ever find that companies are too big to be able to be able to move this fast?
I think that there are a number of companies who sometimes believe they are too big and have too much established process to be able to move fast. But frankly, I don't believe that. I believe that people believe that. But, I think that companies and individuals have a funny way of changing and adapting when their survival is at stake. So we know people can do it. And I think that one of the least understood parts of business, in my opinion, is that people don't always think about how speed disproportionately matters at every stage of business. Unless you don't have competition, it matters whether you're an early stage business, whether you're a mid stage business, and it especially matters when you're a larger business and you have a lot of competitors, especially as a lot of competitors are able to use the cloud. And so, I think that it is a intentional decision that leaders can make, that they are going to organize and change how they operate so that they can move faster. And, we have a lot of ways that we do it inside of Amazon, and it's not by any means the only way to do it. But there's a few things that we do that I think, others may be able to use in their own ways that might be helpful. And I think there are a few ways that we think about moving fast. The first is who you hire. If you hire people who are content moving slow and operating at an incumbent pace, you will move slow. Whereas, we overly index in who we hire on builders. And we think about builders as those who like to invent, but also those who look at a customer experience and try to figure out what's wrong with it, and then have this hunger to change that and to reinvent that. So the first is that we hire builders, and then we try to organize them in as small and separable and autonomous teams as we can so that they own their own destiny. And as we were talking about earlier, in teams sometimes feeling like victims because they don't have the freedom to move fast, if teams own all the resources, there's no more finger pointing between engineering and product management and operations. They're all in the same team and they're all owning it together. They take charge of their own destiny. And so we try to hire builders, organize them in separable teams that own their own destiny, and then we try and give them the same building blocks that all of our AWS external customers have, which are the AWS services. And I think one of the least publicized parts of Amazon's growth the last 10 years has just been the incredible pace with which our consumer businesses have grown. And they will tell you that a big part of that is being able to use AWS. And I think there are two other things that are useful. I think at big companies, as they get bigger, for whatever reason, they start to walk into meetings where they're going to talk about new ideas, looking to find ways to say no. And I don't think it's because they are ill-intended. I just think you get more conservative and it seems harder to manage. And I would say at Amazon, all the senior leaders will tell you their very favorite meetings are the ones about new initiatives. And we don't say yes to everything, but we are very actively spending our time in those meetings trying to find ways to get to yes. We say yes to a lot more than others. And I think the last piece is if you want to invent and you want people to take chances and work on new initiatives, you have to be able to tolerate failure. And none of us like failure. And in Amazon, we have a lot of very achievement-oriented type A people who hate failure. But if you don't allow people to take chances and have an opportunity, if it doesn't work out, to be able to move on to something great, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. None of the good people will work on the new things because it'll be too risky. And
you're a lot bigger company than you joined Amazon, I think, in 1997. In those 23 years, it's become a lot bigger company. Is it harder to, maintain those values and those sort of directions when you get to be this big and this prominent?
Well, I think that arguably the most important part of our being able to retain our culture as we have grown in the number of people and the locations we are and the types of businesses we're pursuing has been our leadership principles. And we have these 14 leadership principles that we're very committed to inside the company that drive everything. They drive our behavior, they drive how we assess people, they drive how we promote people. We call each other out on it. If we feel like somebody is not living up to those leadership principles, it's always one of the things that people feel worst about is if someone tells them that they're not living up to one of those principles. But I think that has been the most important factor in our being able to retain the culture, which, this culture I would say is unusual for lots of reasons, but, probably two of the most unusual parts are that it's inordinately customer focused. We talk a lot about how everything we build starts with the customer and then moves backwards from there. And if you sat in our product development meetings, Dan, you would see that it's almost like the customer is sitting at the table. Many times in each of these meetings, you hear people say, well, is that what customers really want? I talked to this customer and they said what was bothering them was this. Like, it's always with a customer lens on, and it's easy to talk about being customer focused and a lot harder to actually execute on that. But I think the company is unusually focused on customers. And I think the other thing too is that this is a great place for builders. And when we think about our culture, we always want it to be the best place for builders. And I think that just, if you're a builder and you have the ability to kind of imagine anything that you can possibly imagine, and to work on a team that's separable, that gets a chance to own their own destiny with AWS building blocks that allow you to go faster and not have to do as much of the heavy lifting, and then a leadership team that both is willing to say yes to a lot of new ideas and willing to tolerate failure, it's a pretty great place to build.
I'm very struck by your use of the word builders, because in my book, The Prize, in the 19th century, when people were creating the energy industry, they talked about upbuilders, people who made things happen, and you've described that. Well, let's talk about building a little more with the energy industries. There's some companies that don't want to work so much with the energy industries. Where do you see the further opportunities for kind of synergies between tech and energy?
Well, I think that almost everybody I know wants to kind of snap their fingers and have all the energy be 100% renewable energy. And it would be, it's what everybody wants. Unfortunately, it's just not the reality right now. There just isn't enough renewable energy in the world to be able to do so, at least yet. And I think a lot of companies are working on this. And there, as you know, there are a lot of countries in this world that don't have any energy, or adequate access to energy, and their quality of life is very different than what a lot of ours is. And so that is, it's going to take some time, but I think we're all very committed to trying to help. And I think when when I hear about companies not being willing to work with energy companies, the reality is that energy companies have technology infrastructure, whether they use the cloud or don't use the cloud. They have on-premises technology infrastructure that they're going to use. And so we would much rather try to be a part of the solution and enable them to move much more quickly and to be able to be much more energy efficient. If you look at research that's done, and you can look at the 451 research that was just done, they estimate that it's 3.6 times more energy efficient to run technology infrastructure in AWS in the cloud than to run it on premises. And then if you actually add the carbon intensity for the same task, it's 88% more energy efficient to run in AWS than it is on premises. So we'd rather try to be a part of the solution and help energy companies be more energy efficient with the technology infrastructure they're going to use, but also save money and time so they can spend their innovation cycles working on the renewable projects that allow us to all get to 100% renewable like we want.
So the way you're really expressing it is, you're working with them on those goals, both in terms of carbon targets and others, help energy companies meet their ESG goals and meet their climate goals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure I know any companies that aren't focused on the environment right now and who don't understand how important that is to our future. And I think sometimes there's such an urgency to get there that there's lots of thrashing and lots of noise about it. But I think that if you're going to run technology infrastructure, it is so much more energy efficient to be able to do so in the cloud than on premises, and that's because we have much better utilization in the cloud of servers, and more efficient power. Think about how much innovation is in our data centers, given the scale of what we operate. And so, if you can be 3.6 times more energy efficient with the same workloads you have to run, but in the cloud, that changes what your own carbon footprint looks like. And and I also think, again, a lot of what I think is very important for energy companies at this point is finding ways to increase the amount of time and energy and resource they can spend on renewable projects. And again, the cloud allows you to kind of save those dollars, as well as move much more quickly and innovate.
Yeah. And reallocate the dollars.
Yeah.
Well, let's then turn to what Amazon Web Services is doing in terms of its own agenda on this. What are your goals in terms of, you use a lot of electric power. What are your goals there?
Well, I think if you look at, in general, what we're doing as a company, we're the co-founders and the first signatory in the Climate Pledge, which is to be, a commitment to be carbon zero by 2040, which is 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement, which is not simple. It's going to be very challenging to do. And we also said we're going to be 100% renewable by 2030, and we're working really hard to try and beat that goal as well. And, I think one of the reasons that we chose to announce this and take this pledge, which is a very aggressive pledge, is that we wanted to try to inspire more companies to invent alongside us and to partner, because it's not going to be simple to get there, not just for us, but for lots of other companies. And I think you may have seen that just in the last few days, we've announced this $2 billion fund to fund renewable projects that change what, the speed with which we can all get to carbon zero. And so it's a big priority for the company. It's a big priority for AWS and for the rest of Amazon. And, and we're looking for as many partners as we can to help accomplish it. I think the future of, our kids' future and our grandkids' future depend on our having that success. And it won't be simple to get there, but we're committed to it.
And is the $2 billion fund, is that basically a venture capital fund?
It's just a fund that we're going to administer, and we're going to start receiving proposal, and we'll fund the things that we think can have a big impact.
Right. And just to add, of course, what you do on renewable electricity is very important, because, you use a lot of electricity, don't you?
We do use a fair bit of electricity, and we've been working on this. We obviously haven't just started working on this, but we've been working on this for several years. And as I said, we have a very strong commitment to getting to both 100% renewable and carbon zero.
Right. So, Andy, you've been, just the last question here, you've been 23 years in Amazon. It's not the company you joined 23 years ago. Just, what is it like personally to be in a company that is growing so fast and has such an impact in changing the global economy?
Well, I feel incredibly lucky to be able to work at Amazon. When I came in 1997, I took my last final exam in graduate school the first Friday in May in 1997, and I started at Amazon 3 days later, that next Monday. And at the time, nobody would tell me what team I was going to work on, or what my title was going to be, or what my function was going to be. But for whatever reason, it was very important to Amazon that I get there that Monday. And I came, and I really...
Do you remember why it was important for you to get there on Monday?
We have always had this culture, and it was, it's particularly true then, but I think it's really still true in our businesses today. Like we are pursuing land rush opportunities where every day matters, and there's this urgency and this speed and this mission passion that I've never seen in any other company. And so there was just this feeling that what we were doing was this incredible opportunity that was moving really quickly, with lots of different other companies that were going to pursue it as well, and loads of issues customers wanted us to solve that we just needed more people to solve it. And so, I came, and frankly, my then fiance, now wife, we agreed that we would come to Seattle for 2 to 3 years and then head back to the East Coast, which is where I'm from. And we lived on the East Coast prior to moving out to Seattle. And we kind of agreed, we kind of agreed on a napkin in a bar as we were making the decision on where to go. And that was 23 years ago. My wife has inform me that the statute of limitations on that napkin has expired.
Right.
But I feel incredibly lucky to have been part of this adventure that we're still in the very early days of being on. And I think the reason that all of us who've been here for a while are still here and love it is just that there is no ceiling to what we think is possible. If we believe that there's a customer experience that is worth fixing and that could be meaningful for the company and that isn't being well served and where we have a differentiated approach, we're willing to pursue it and try and fix it, even if it's really different from what the rest of the company has done to date. I mean, think about how different AWS is from our retail business. Those were really different businesses. And so if you're somebody who likes to build, and if you're somebody who's entrepreneurial, and I'd done my own businesses before I went back to graduate school and came to Amazon, and you're somebody who likes focusing on customers, and if you're a consumer of any business, you know what it's like to be treated poorly by companies. If that experience has left a dent, and you want to be customer focused, this is a very unusual place. And so it's. I think if it ever felt like a big company, I would have a different feel about it, but it never has. It continues to feel like a very entrepreneurial, customer-focused, builder-oriented company, and I'm lucky to be here with the team I'm with.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Dan. It's always great to have a chance to chat with you.
Thank you. We've been talking with Andy Jassy, who's the CEO of Amazon Web Services, and talking about being a builder. And he's certainly been a builder as he's led Amazon Web Services from an idea to being in itself a very huge enterprise, and one that we've heard today that is not only changing many industries, including the energy industry, changing the global economy, and has played a very important role in terms of dealing with COVID-19, enabling the world to continue to work and to function, and certainly will continue to have enormous impact going forward. So thank you very much for joining us for the CERA Week conversation. We look forward to our next discussion.
Thanks for having me.